Hello and welcome to topic 4, lecture 2. And in this lecture, we're going to dig in more deeply in terms of the specific liberties that are outlined in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so what is the goal of this lecture? Now, look, there is a lot to learn about civil liberties. In fact, I teach an entire course on civil liberties, which you can take if you're interested in the spring. And so in this one lecture, in this 1 week, right, we're not going to be able to really do justice to civil liberties. But this is an introductory class, right? And so the whole idea here is to really get a broad overview of the different liberties that are in the Bill of Rights, okay? So my job here is that we're going to be taking a look at 3 or 4 major themes in civil liberties and individual rights. And so we're going to focus on religion, speech, the right to privacy, and the rights of the criminally accused, okay? Now, it's incumbent upon you to read the textbook, okay? Because, I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail in the lecture. There's a lot more detail in the textbook, so it's a mandatory that you read that. Now, if there's any liberty up there, I don't have the right to bear arms up there. There are other liberties that aren't up there. If there's any liberty you want to talk about in more detail, or that we don't talk about in the lecture, feel free to come into office hours. I'd love to talk to you about any particular personal liberty that you're interested in. So that's the goals of the lecture. Let's go ahead and get started. So remember the last lecture when I was like young and I'm like, I can watch whatever I want to watch. I can say whatever I want to say, like liberty, like nobody tell me, not to do what I want to do, right? Well, that quite frankly is a pretty immature way of thinking about civil liberties. Okay, well, we're all immature at certain points in our life. And so here's what I want you to think about as you're learning about civil liberties in this week. Civil liberties, as it says there, and let me put my magic pen on just to reinforce it. Civil liberties should be thought about as a balancing of interests, okay? You got a little scale here, which balances the interests between certain things. And so on the one hand, civil liberties is really about an individual's freedom to live your life the way you want to live your life, to express yourself in the way that you want to express yourself, to worship or not worship in the way you want to, that you want to worship, to read newspapers or and watch news shows that you want to do, and to be free from government intruding upon your private places, right? That what it means to live in a democracy means that you have the right to live freely. However, there are definite limits that are placed on the right to live freely. Remember back when we were talking about Thomas Hobbes and the state of nature. And remember Thomas Hobbes said the state of nature was the state of war. The great thing about the state of nature is you could do whatever the F you wanted, right? You want to take somebody's property? You could. You want to run through the streets naked? You could, right? You could do whatever you wanted. Maximum liberty. But as Thomas Hobbes reminds us, nobody wants to live in that society, right? Because it's chaotic and it's dangerous. And you're always looking behind your shoulder, right? Behind your back. What's coming to get me, right? And so civil liberties in a democratic society, it must be balanced against the role that the state plays in making sure that the state is able to do its job, okay? And so the state has to provide order and security for people. The state has to make sure that people are not being discriminated against, right? That there are obligations. The state needs to get its job done. It needs to, have voting precincts where you go and cast your vote, right? And so when we're learning about civil liberties, that what we're going to be learning about is that it's oftentimes a balance between the individual's right to live freely, but the state's interests and obligation that it has to make sure that we actually live in a stable and ordered society. And that, so you're really going to be seeing a lot of times where the state will put laws in the book, it'll infringe upon an individual's rights, and an individual will say, hey, state, you can't do that. But the state comes back and says, we have an absolute obligation to do that. We are allowed to curtail your rights. And so keep that balance of interest in mind. You can't do whatever you want. It is a balance between your rights and the interests of the state. And it is the Supreme Court that determines what the proper balance is. Do the scales go towards the rights of the individual to live freely, or do the scales bend towards the interests and obligation of the state? So keep that in mind as you're reading these cases this week. Okay, so we're going to start with two aspects of the First Amendment, okay? But hey, let's read it again. I know we read it in the last lecture, but really, can you read the First Amendment too many times? The First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so, as I had mentioned in the last lecture, that, there are 5 distinct liberties that are outlined in the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition, okay? And in this lecture, we're going to focus on first religion and then second speech. And then later in the semester, when we do the media chapter, we'll be talking about press freedoms, okay? So let's get started on religion. Okay, so when it comes to religious freedoms, and the First Amendment, the First Amendment has 2 things to sort of say about religious freedoms, okay? So it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, I have that in yellow, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, okay? And these, within that phrase, that we see that there are 2 clauses, okay? And one is known as, the yellow one is known as the Establishment Clause, and the other is known as the Free Exercise Clause. So what does that mean? What the Establishment Clause is saying is that that you as an individual have freedom from the state imposing any particular religion upon you. In other words, the Congress, and also this would apply to the states and local governments, they cannot establish a religion. They can't, say that the national religion of the United States is Catholicism, right? That would clearly violate the Establishment Clause. But as we're going to see as we talk about some of the religious cases, that it goes beyond that, right? I mean, clearly if Congress declared Catholicism the national religion, it's a clear violation of the Establishment Clause. But what if you're in public school and they start the day with a prayer? Is that an establishment of religion, right? What if we have money and on the money it says, in God we trust, right? It's federal money, it's state money. Does that violate the Establishment Clause, okay? And so, Establishment Clause is about the freedom from the state imposing any particular religion. The question that often comes to the court is this truly an establishment of religion? And we'll see what the courts have to say about that. The other clause within that first clause of the First Amendment is known as the Free Exercise Clause. What does that mean? Well, the Free Exercise Clause, so the Establishment Clause is telling the states you can't establish a religion, right? The Free Exercise Clause is telling the states and the federal government, the people are free to practice the religion of their choice without state interference, okay? And so that an obvious example of state interference is, let's say that you're Jewish and you're going to go to synagogue on Friday night and the state is prohibiting you from going to synagogue to worship. Clearly, that is a violation of your free exercise rights, right? Your free exercise of your religion, okay? And so not only can government not establish religion, but also government can't prevent you from practicing the religion of choice, your religion of choice as well. So you might have noticed that the First Amendment, starts not with freedom of speech or the freedom of the press or the freedom to assembly, but it starts with freedom of religion. Okay, and I think that's telling in a way that that the liberty that is at the first liberty to be mentioned is religion. It tells us a little bit about our political culture. It tells us about the role that religion played in its founding. And so let's look at when the First Amendment was written. Let's look at what the goals of these religious clauses were. Okay, so one of the goals of the religious clauses was to reduce conflict. Now, a lot of times when we think about early American colonial history, right? We sort of think about the colonies as being monolithic in terms of its religion. It was a bunch of Christians, right? Well, indeed, it was a bunch of Christians, right? But as we know, there are huge differences within Christianity, right? And so, for example, Maryland, right? Christian, but Catholic. Pennsylvania, Christian, but Quaker. Virginia, Christian, but Anglican, adopt the church, Church of England. There were a lot of, and then farther south, Baptist, okay? There were a lot of different religions within the United States at the time. And those religious differences, I know we're always like religion peaceful, but we know that religion globally, internationally, in the United States as well, is a source of conflict. And the early colonies in the early states experienced that conflict, right? The conflict that, where the dominant religious group was, harming those who were in the minority religious groups, okay? And so by saying that, by taking the federal government out of the role, saying the federal government can't establish religion, it was a means of reducing that conflict, right? Because it's basically saying, we're going to leave these battles between religions to themselves. We're not going to add the state saying, yep, giddy up Catholicism or giddy up Anglicanism, right? We're not going to do that, because if the state gets added to, the state religion is X, it just, with the power of the state, it's just going to exacerbate that conflict and really trample upon the rights of those who are not in the dominant religion. And so the goal was to reduce conflict and really to provide protection for outgroup religions. Another aspect of this was that the freedom to worship and to not worship. James Madison writes about how your personal conscience, in terms of what your beliefs are to these fundamental questions about, is there a supreme being? What happens to you after you die? These huge universal and moral questions that oftentimes religions try to answer. James Madison knew that those were incredibly important to what it meant to be free. You get to decide that. And so, again, it was really sort of like the ability to worship or not worship is so intertwined with what it means to be a human, that we really want people to make those choices for themselves and not to have government involved with it. Now, one of the sort of byproducts of getting government out of religion early on, because in Europe that didn't happen, right? I mean, you had the kings would align with a religion, and then even to this day, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, it's state sponsored. That one of the byproducts of this is that getting the state out of the mix really allowed for a proliferation of lots of different kinds of religions in the United States, right? Mormonism is a great example of that. It's an American religion. And because it was sort of like, hey, nobody's forced to worship one way or the other, trying to, bring adherence into your tribe. And that, also it's actually increased the level of religiosity in the United States. Even though the United States has a high GDP and is a wealthy country, we have a high level of religiosity. Other countries like us that are rich, more wealthy, they have a much lower level of religiosity. And a lot of scholars think that is because government has not really been in the mix in terms of promoting religion. So some of the consequences of, as I mentioned there, of the religious clauses are these high level of religiosity that we have in the United States. That religiosity is a strong religious feeling or a belief, even though we're seeing more people that don't consider themselves affiliated with one denomination or another religious denomination, the nuns, and I don't mean nuns like with habits, but like Nones, that, still people, there's a high level of people in the United States who believe in God, et cetera, et cetera. And as I mentioned too, that religious pluralism, okay? And so we've got the goals of the clauses and then some of the consequences of the clauses as well. Okay, so let's focus on the Establishment Clause and just get a good understanding of what the Establishment Clause is. And then you can use this information to sort of guide yourself as you're reading the specific Establishment Clause cases in the textbook. The Establishment Clause is really this sort of separation between church and state. Even though that word separation, or that phrase separation of church and state, is not in the Constitution, it was actually in some of the writings of Thomas Jefferson, where he is talking about that there needs to be this strong separation of church and state. So what does separation of church and state mean? Well, it's been defined by the Supreme Court over time, okay? But basically what it means is, obviously, the separation of church and state, the Establishment Clause forbids establishing a national religion, but it also forbids aiding one religion over another, okay? So giving tax breaks to one religion, but not to another, putting a display up in a town square that is only one religion, but not the other. And that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause. So you can't aid one religion over another. It also forbids the advancing or inhibiting religion, okay? So if laws are somehow advancing religion or making it difficult to practice religion, that's going to be a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so basically, government needs to be neutral when it comes to religion. It can't take a side. It can't support one religion and diminish another or be hostile towards another religion. It needs to be neutral. And any law that has any kind of implication on religion must have a secular purpose, okay? So for example, if you are having, let's say grants that different entities can compete for, okay? And let's say those governmental grants are for drug treatment programs, okay? And then religious institutions or agencies apply for those grants to get that money to help with their drug treatment program that they might have, within their religious institution. That wouldn't violate the Establishment Clause, even though that money is going potentially to a religious agency, which might seem like it's supporting that religious agency. The point of those grants is a secular purpose to help people with drug addictions, okay? It's not always so clear, as you're going to see as you work your way through the cases. Our school vouchers, does that establish religion? Does it support religion, et cetera? Or our school vouchers, really where you can use those to go to religious schools, are they really at the bottom line have a secular purpose? Now, the question about the separation of church and state is, okay, we're going to separate church and state, but how tall and strong is the wall between church and state going to be? Well, just in summary, that the Supreme Court's been very consistent that there's a strong and almost impenetrable wall between church and states in matters of what takes place in public schools, okay? And so when it comes to school prayers, even moments of silence, having preachers or any sort of religious leader come and give prayers at graduations, public school graduation ceremonies, teaching religious curriculum, okay, all putting up the 10 Commandments outside the principal's office, All of that has been deemed unconstitutional, an unconstitutional violation of the Establishment Clause by the Supreme Court. And I think the thinking is that, that children are impressionable and that they should be getting these teachings from their parents. And also, like, if you do a school prayer and you're like, well, if you don't want to do the school prayer, go stand out in the hallway. Johnny, if you don't want to do it, okay, go stand with the other atheists, right? I mean, kids are, impressionable, and they might just go along with the group. So the Supreme Court has been very consistently having a strong wall between church and state in schools. Keep in mind, this is public schools, okay? The Bill of Rights only applies to public entities. If you go to a private school, you can do whatever you want for the most part as it relates to, school prayer. Do make sure that you take a look at the Lemon test in the textbook. It is the test that the Supreme Court uses, although they've been wanting to get rid of it for a long time, to help us understand whether or not the Establishment Clause has been violated, particularly as it relates to schools. Now, there's a lower and much more porous wall on other matters, not having to do with schools. So the Supreme Court has allowed religious displays in public squares, in city halls, as long as they are diverse and anybody who wants to, have a religious display can have it. So that's when the Satanists come out and the Festivus pole comes out. And it's like, hey, if the Baptists can have their display, we want our display, and that they're bound to, by the Establishment Clause to allow that diversity of display. In God we trust, on our currency is allowed. Tax support for religious schools is allowed. Getting tax breaks for religious entities is allowed. And you can read more about that in the chapter or come on by office hours and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Okay, so the second of the religious clauses is what's known as the Free Exercise Clause. And what the Free Exercise Clause is that it's about a person's ability to exercise their religion. And so the Free Exercise Clause says that a person can believe in and practice their religion of choice. Government can't force you to worship, and also a person can hold no religious belief without consequence from the government, okay? And so you can freely exercise or not exercise your religion. One might think about sort of the government demanding that somebody take a religious oath of office before they serve in a particular governmental position. And that would clearly be a violation of the Free Exercise Clause, right? To profess your belief in God as a qualification to serve is in many ways sort of like a way that the government is maybe not forcing you to worship, but forcing you to designate yourself as having a religion. And if you weren't able to serve, right, if you didn't profess your belief to a God or to being a Christian, then there's a consequence for doing that. That's forbidden by the Free Exercise Clause. Now, I want you to keep in mind that just as we were talking about at the beginning of the lecture, that there's a balance between the interests of the state and the rights of the individual to exercise their freedoms. That's the case with the Free Exercise Clause. And it's referred to as the belief-action distinction within free exercise of religion. When it comes to what you believe religiously, that is absolutely protected, okay? You can believe, you can hold a religious belief that is, it could be, I believe that I must murder people in order to go to heaven, right? Or, that I must, drink the blood of my next door neighbor's dog. I don't know why I'm coming up with these horrible examples in order to be saved. You can believe that, right? But that you can't necessarily practice those things, okay? And so while you can hold that belief, that the state has an obligation to protect people getting murdered for your religious beliefs, or the property of people like animals. Not that animals are necessarily property. So religious practice can be restricted if government shows that there's a compelling reason for that restriction. And so a good example of that, and it was a recent example, I guess it's not that recent anymore, but probably over 10 years ago, there was a case up in Wausau, Wisconsin, where there was a family and their religious beliefs were that when somebody got sick, that you would pray for that person and that you would not seek medical treatment. And in that case, in this family, one of the daughters had epilepsy, and they prayed over her, and she ultimately died. And they argued in court that they were exercising their religious beliefs. However, the Supreme Court has always said that, that particularly when it comes to exercising your religious beliefs in a way that harms other, that the state is well within their rights to restrict or even, criminalize that behavior because of the actions, the harmful actions that it has on other people. All right, let's turn our sights now to freedom of speech. And there is the First Amendment's part regarding freedom of speech where it says Congress will make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now, there are a couple things I want you to keep in mind. One thing I want you to keep in mind that the First Amendment applies to the government action. As it says there, freedom of speech concerns government's effort to censor speech. Remember in the last lecture, we talked about how the Bill of Rights is a thou shalt not. It's telling government what it can't do, okay? And so, for example, if, let's say, the city of Milwaukee, they passed an ordinance prohibiting speeches about poodles, okay? Now, you guys know I love poodles, right? So let's say they passed an ordinance that said nobody can make a speech about poodles in the public parks. Well, that would be a clear violation of the First Amendment because the city of Milwaukee and their aldermanic council is a governmental body. On the flip side of that, let's say Mark Zuckerberg, let's say him and his people hate poodles. And let's say they passed a rule for Facebook that said that nobody can make speeches about poodles or posts about poodles, and if they do, they will be kicked off of the platform. That doesn't implicate the First Amendment because why? Facebook is not a governmental organization. If they want to ban certain sorts of speech, they can because it's a private organization. So keep that in mind. Freedom of speech concerns government's effort to censor speech. Speech, the word speech has never been literally interpreted by the Supreme Court. That you could say speech only means utterances that are coming out of the mouth, but the Supreme Court has never construed speech in that way. Speech includes all forms of communication. And so one form of communication, and it's probably the most predominant form, is what is known as pure speech, okay? And that is spoken or written communication used to convey an idea. And so maybe a more traditional method of speech where you go into the town square and you give or a local park and you give a speech or you hand out pamphlets, okay? However, this First Amendment also covers a speech that's known as symbolic speech. And what symbolic speech is it's where you're trying to communicate an idea through an action, not through written or spoken speech. And so good examples of symbolic speech are burning a flag and a draft card, like during the Vietnam War. And you'll be reading about those cases in your textbook. No words need to be uttered when burning a flag. You're burning it because you're trying to communicate an idea, and that's symbolic speech. Now, whether or not symbolic speech and pure speech, for that matter, are protected by the First Amendment, that's for the Supreme Court to determine. Now, as you'll notice as you are reading through the textbook, you'll see that the Supreme Court over and over again provides very high level of protections for pure speech, or that type of speech that is transmitting ideas, okay? And as you'll see, the Supreme Court says that even hateful and offensive pure speech is protected. As long as that hateful and offensive speech is communicating an idea, a belief, and that it's not engaging in any sort of threatening or presenting a clear and present danger, which we'll talk about in a second, it is protected speech. And so you'll be reading about the landmark case Snyder v. Phelps in the textbook. And, that's a case about Westboro Baptist Church that has historically been known for holding very offensive signs about LGBTQ folks outside of soldiers' funerals, because they think that soldiers die because the U.S. government allows LGBTQ people to serve in the military, and their signs are extraordinarily offensive. But they said, the Supreme Court said, as long as they're abiding by the time, manner, place sort of rules, and doing their speech in an area that's designated for free speech, it's allowed. And also the debate that you're going to be engaging in this week is also going to be taking a look at offensive speech and to what degree it should or should not be protected. So you might be wondering, well, particularly, why is hateful and offensive speech protected, right? Why are there such high levels of protection on speech? Well, and the reasoning is just you really can't have a democracy without the free exchange of ideas. I mean, for one, if you live in a democracy, democracy is the will of the people. If you don't know what the will of the people is, and how we find out what the people want is through their ability to freely speak, well, then we're living in a democracy in name only. We also need to hear all viewpoints in order to determine which viewpoints, to challenge viewpoints, to bring us closer to what is truth. And so we can't prevent certain ideas from being presented, because in doing that, we might be presenting the truth from being presented in a marketplace of ideas. And also, by hearing all different viewpoints, you also have the ability to deal with and think moderately and respectfully, and deal with opinions that you do not agree with. And that is that kind of control, that kind of compromise, that willingness to see that you might disagree with what people are saying, but that they have the right to say it. That is, obviously a hallmark value of living in a democratic society. And having freedom of speech assures that we can come closer to realizing that value. So much speech is protected by the First Amendment, but not all speech. Some speech does fall outside of First Amendment protections. In other words, there's some types of speech where it's okay, and in fact, probably beneficial, that the government can take action to prohibit that kind of speech. Now, you'll be learning about sort of the tests that we use when it comes to which kinds of sort of speech that is communicating an idea, pure speech. The test that's used to determine whether or not pure speech can be prohibited is what's known as the clear and present danger speech. And you'll be reading about the case Brandenburg v. Ohio in the textbook. This is a case about a Ku Klux Klan rally, and that one of the people at the rally was, saying these, sort of using language that was seemed to be directed at killing people. Okay. And so the court said that speech that does present a clear and present danger is not protected. However, it's for speech to actually present a clear and present danger, that's a pretty high bar. It has to be speech that's directed to or producing imminent lawless action, and it is likely to incite or produce such action. Okay, so it's not just speech that is directed at lawless action, but it's likely that what's being said is going to produce this lawless action. It's a pretty high bar to jump over, but that is the test that we use, and it's telling because it leaves a lot of space for speech to be protected. Other examples of speech that aren't protected are fighting words, and so if the only point of your words is to get somebody in a fight, right, to bring about a fight, those are not protected. Criminal speech is not protected, and so conspiracy to commit crimes, that speech, that is not protected by the First Amendment. You cannot conspire through your words to commit a crime. Libel and slander, that is knowingly defaming somebody, either in the written or the oral manner, that is not protected. Harassment is not, and neither is obscenity. Pornography is, but if it reaches the bar of being considered obscene by the court, that is not protected speech. Okay, so let's turn our sights away from the First Amendment to another liberty that's found in the Bill of Rights, And that liberty is what is known as the right to privacy. Now, a lot of times when I teach about the right to privacy, students think that the right to privacy is the rights that you have in the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment is an incredibly important aspect of privacy, right? But the Fourth Amendment is really very specific. The Fourth Amendment is about police coming into your house and engaging in an unreasonable search, okay? Or not just your house, but any part of your effects and your personhood. But the right to privacy is really more than being free from unreasonable police searches. The right to privacy is really this right to be left alone, for the government to leave your private matters, whether that's matters of where you want to send your kid to school, what you want to teach your child, who you marry, what you do inside of your house, right? Who you have sex with, whether or not you want to, end your life, right? That these all kind of fall under this idea of the right to privacy. That is that the government really doesn't have a right to interfere with your private life unless they have a really good reason to do it. Now, sometimes when I teach this, students are like, "Hey, I've got nothing to hide. Come on in, government. Like, I don't need a right to privacy because I'm not doing anything wrong. So come on into my house, government." But really, when you stop and think about that, that's what it would really be like to live in an authoritarian state, right? I mean, the authoritarian state just decides who they want to, whose privacy they want to violate, and that they can have free reign to bust into your house, see what you're reading, and just basically intimidate you, place fear in your heart. And so the right to privacy, this idea that you have a fundamental right to be left alone, is really an important aspect of a democratic society. And so, as I said, it governs the issues of private matter, whether or not you can use birth control, whether or not you can have an abortion, consensual adult sex, marriage, the right to die, and even the fundamental right to have a family and to raise your family as you see fit. All of those fall into the issue of the right to privacy. Now, what's interesting about the right to privacy and what makes it highly controversial is that it's not specifically stated in the Constitution. When you look at the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law, right? ... There's no amendment that says Congress shall make no law invading your right to privacy, right? So it's not specifically stated in the Constitution. It's been derived from several places. When the right to privacy was first presented in the landmark case of Griswold versus Connecticut about birth control, you'll be reading about it in the textbook, the court said that when you collect together certain parts of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, right to remain silent, and then the Ninth Amendment, when you bring those together, it creates the right to privacy. But today, where we find the right to privacy is in the due process clauses that are found in the Fifth Amendment that applies to the national government, and that is found in the 14th Amendment that applies to the states. And what the due process clause says that the government, the federal government, nor shall the states deprive a person of their life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And so the court has said that this privacy right is one of these liberties that the government can't take from you unless they follow due process, right? That they have a good reason to take it away from you. Obviously, the right to privacy has been a source of controversy because the right to privacy relates to some hot topics. It's a source of controversy because there's questions about whether or not the Constitution provides protection for birth control, abortion, sex, marriage. And there's, controversy because it's not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. So, I mean, I teach a class on civil liberties. I could go on forever about this, which I, quite frankly, looking at the time, am kind of this is going on a bit too long. But make sure that you look at the key cases that deal with the establishment of the right to privacy. Griswold versus Connecticut establishes that you have a marital right to use birth control. Later on, they extended that right to everybody. Roe establishes that a woman or a person who can get pregnant has a constitutional right to have an abortion in the first trimester. Lawrence is a key case that says two consenting adults can have sex with who they want to have sex with, whether they're a straight couple or a gay or lesbian couple. Obergefell extends the right to privacy to marriage, that gay and lesbian couples have the right to marry. And Dobbs, as we know, is the case that overturned Roe, saying that the right to privacy does not extend to the right to have an abortion. It actually called into question, too, whether or not we actually have a right to privacy for other things, such as marriage and birth control. So like I said at the beginning of this lecture, this is really just a quick guidepost to help kind of focus your reading as you're reading through the chapter on the civil liberties. And so that brings us to the due process, the rights of the criminally accused. As we know that to live in a democratic society, the government can take away your liberty, they can take away your life, and they can take away your property, but they need to do it by a known and set process, one that's established in advance and is followed. And so the Bill of Rights, large parts of the Bill of Rights, in fact, I think it says here that 40% of the Bill of Rights is dedicated to the rights of the criminally accused. And so the key rights for the criminally accused are the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment. As I stated in the last slide, the 4th Amendment deals with the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. The 5th Amendment deals with the right that you have to remain silent, that the government can't force you to speak in a way that might lead to you confessing a crime or implicating yourself in a crime. The 6th Amendment has everything to do with a jury trial and all the rights that are afforded to you during and before the trial as well, including the right to a criminal defense attorney. And then the 8th Amendment deals with the punishment that you would get if found guilty, and that punishment can neither be cruel nor unusual. And these are sort of the essence of the due process of law. Now, these amendments outline the rights granted to those accused of committing a crime. And as I said there, that 40% of the Bill of Rights is dedicated to the rights of the criminally accused. Why is that? Why is so much of the Bill of Rights dedicated to the rights of the criminally accused? Well, for one, as colonists, the colonists knew exactly what it was like to be prosecuted without the due process of law. And so it was right in their minds when they were sort of thinking about that to live in a democratic society, you have to make sure that there are checks on the power of the state when they are pursuing criminal activities. And also this, I teach criminal justice, and we talk about how the state is mighty and the individual is weak, particularly when it comes to criminal matters, okay? It's easy to say everybody deserves their First Amendment rights to speak, right? But when somebody's accused of a crime, a lot of times we assume that they are guilty, and there's like, oh, well, they were unreasonably searched, but at least we got them. Or so what? They're getting cruel punishment. They deserve it, okay? Well, the state is mighty, and oftentimes we don't care about an individual who is accused of a crime. But to make sure that justice is actually prevailing, we have to make sure that the playing field is somewhat level, that the state doesn't have all of the power, but the criminally accused has the power of due process. And these amendments are the ones that assure that. Okay, well, thanks a lot for listening. I really appreciate it. I know this lecture was a little bit longer, but there's a lot to cover when it comes to civil liberties. It's an incredibly important issue, and I hope this lecture allows you to at least have a good through-line understanding of the material presented in the textbook. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon.